Listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Can an Infrastructure Sustainability Rating System Point the Way Toward More Harmonious Living? Presented by Bob Beinstein and co-sponsored by GBFI, the Global Business and Financial Institute, and the William Patterson Alumni Association. Before I introduce today's presenter, I'd like to go over how the webinar will work. First of all, you'll be able to view the presentation on your computer screen. You'll also be able to hear the presentation through your computer's audio system. Please feel free to ask questions during the webinar by typing them in. We will be monitoring the questions and we'll answer all the questions at the end. So anytime you have a question, feel free to write it in and we will address them at the end. Any questions that are not answered in today's webinar will be addressed after the webinar is completed. You will have the contact information for the presenter. And now I'd like to introduce today's topic and speaker. Bob Beinstein is Director of Sustainability for the Environmental Financial Consulting Group, Inc., a business consultancy that works with AEC firms on the financial aspects of the engineering and construction industry. He works closely with the Zofnass Program for Sustainable Infrastructure at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure, roles that leverage his passion for articulating the business case for realigning engineering and corporate practices around sustainable outcomes. Bob has a BS in Civil and Environmental Engineering and has held technical and managerial roles in the commercial nuclear industry, managed environmental programs in the federal marketplace, and has led a diverse array of client service-related work. He is an advisory board member at the Zofnass Program, a licensed professional engineer, a credentialed Envision sustainability professional, an approved Envision trainer, and a member of the Tau Beta National Engineering Honor Society. In today's webinar, Robert will explore the myriad ways infrastructure is interconnected and how the interconnectedness poses both risks and opportunities for communities. He will also discuss how societies may want to rethink how they define and measure progress and propose that perhaps it is time to think beyond economic success and GDP in the ongoing quest for an improving quality of life. And now I would like to introduce today's presenter, Bob Beinstein. Bob?
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. So for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to take you on a short tour of the world of sustainable infrastructure and look at how, when we approach it and think about it differently, it reaches beyond traditional boundaries. So just as kind of a primer, first we're going to set the table by looking at why we're working on this. What is the challenge here? From there, we'll focus on Envision, which at its core is a sustainability rating system for infrastructure, but as you'll see, serves as a little bit more than that. We'll pull out a couple of examples from the Envision credits and look at how these connect to more global goals. Then I'll take you through a real-world example that's been completed already and actually exists, so you can see sort of how it works in the real world. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about where the program's going, then I'll leave you with a couple of points that at the moment I'll call food for thought. And if all goes according to plan, we should have about 15 minutes left for Q&A. So buckle your seatbelt. Here goes. If I can make it switch. Good. Okay, I may have to call in a lifeline. This worked before we started.
It did work before we started. Oh, there we go.
I'll just see if I can do it that way for the moment. I don't know if that will work or not. Let me turn this off and see if that helps. Okay, so to call infrastructure important is perhaps the understatement of the century. Every day we get up, we run water from an intricate aging system of pipes, valves, storage basins, water treatment plants. We cook food with fuel from oil wells, gas pipelines, one of the many sources of energy that feed the electrical grid. And we travel to work and play on roads, bridges, paths, the like. It's all part of this incredibly complex thing that we call infrastructure. And by and large, we don't even notice. That's kind of the cool thing about it. So it's a pretty tough world out there. When we do take the time to think about infrastructure, it does some pretty amazing things for us. These days, we're running headlong into what I've called here some new realities. We're on a finite planet. And we're using the resources that support everything we do at an alarming and, dare I say, unsustainable rate. Budgets are strained, it's getting worse. Fabric of societies across the globe are strained. In many cases to the limit. As population grows, this doesn't get any easier. I think this is especially pertinent today, when we look at the United States and the situation we're in with polarized viewpoints. From an infrastructure perspective, what we used to consider success on budget and on time is no longer sufficient. So what can we do to make sure each project we do serves as many purposes as it can, improving our lives without diminishing our kids' ability to enjoy the same benefits? Not a simple question. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of slides here to add some detail to what I just talked about. And this slide is a bit of a setup slide. This is a graph of the Human Development Index against human footprint on Earth. Now, the Human Development Index is a UN-defined commodity. That's across the bottom, and I will see if I can get my little laser pointer back. So this is the HDI, Human Development Index. It includes things like the ability to live a long and healthy life, being knowledgeable, being educated, having a decent standard of living. Now, it's highest, obviously, on the right at 1.0. This is completely undeveloped down here. So, kind of the Western world, US is up in this quadrant. Anything above 0.8 is generally considered fully developed. Now, on the right side, this is the ecological cost of achieving that quality of life. It's essentially the supply of and demand on the world's resources. What can the Earth supply? How much of our use and waste can it process? The units are a little weird if you've never seen this before. It's hectares per person. A hectare is roughly 2.5 acres, give or take 10,000 square meters. And it's essentially impact normalized to land area. So how much natural capital do we spend on our quality of life? Now, this horizontal dotted line here is Earth's carrying capacity. It's about 1.7 to 1.8 hectares per person on the footprint scale. Now, this will change with population growth. More people, we got less available per person. It makes sense. And the vertical dotted line here is the boundary of what we call developed status. So it's pretty clear, I think, from looking at this, especially since I labeled it in green, that this little quadrant here is where we want to be. That's a sweet spot, right? Okay, now we're going to throw some data onto this chart. If I can get rid of my little laser pointer again. This is complicated. Okay. This is a 2006 data set. It was the last time the Footprint Network did it in this method and using that graph that I showed. So it's clear that we in the West are way outliving our means. If you look at the USA up on the top, it's about 1.9 or about 9 hectares per person. So the challenge is, how do we make a meaningful shift down from that big orange dot toward the sustainability quadrant without actually moving way to the left and becoming undeveloped or going back to living in caves, as people like to euphemistically say? Clearly, the answer is multifaceted. This is not a simple question. So it's energy efficiency, it's reducing dependence on fossil fuel, lower greenhouse gas, increase water recycling, reuse water, etc. That's just a few. But our ability to instigate any comprehensive and well thought out action is pretty hampered these days, not only by the limited resources, because it costs money to do this, but by the multiple priorities and agendas of those potentially affected by the actions people might propose. Okay, so fast forward 4 years. Now, this is the 2010 data set. Really hard to see on the screen, and I acknowledge that. So I'm going to pull out a few data points for your consideration. Recall that in the last graph, the USA clearly had the biggest impact in the world at 9 hectares per person, but pretty decent quality of life to go with it. So now in this graph, we're going to see a little bit of a disturbing trend. As the developing world, and frankly some in the Western world, look at the US, they want what they see. Independent transportation, get our cars go wherever we want, whenever we want. Air conditioning, 24/7 power, etc. And you know what? Who can blame them? It's a pretty nice way to live, right? So in this graphic, our available biocapacity is still around 1.7 hectares per person. Not a lot of population change in that 4 years. But now the players have changed. Many of the developing nations, smaller nations both in the Middle East and in the Caribbean, as well as some Western countries, have learned. Unfortunately, they've learned from us. So we're doing somewhat better, interestingly, at about 7, just north of 7 hectares per person, down 2, which is a good trend. But here's some of the other nations that have soared past us. Where's the US now? So I'm going to go through the top few. There's Kuwait. They're at almost 11, 10.5. Terrible trend for them. Qatar. The petro oligarchies have really outstripped us. The Emirates. Interesting, Denmark in Scandinavia, one of the more enlightened, generally acknowledged to be one of the more enlightened countries in the world. And this really makes me kind of want to go back to school and study these things because I could spend a lot of time on this. Belgium, Trinidad and Tobago, where's the US? Man, we've done better. Trinidad and Tobago, really? Singapore. And here's the US at number 8. So while we're going in the right direction, it would seem that a lot of the world is not. I don't think that's a good trend. Unless you think, yeah, but you know, if you look at the lower end of the chart, globally it seems to average out no such luck. There's a world's average at 2.5 hectares per person. Recall, on an available supply of 1.7. It's kind of like starting out on a 45-day trip with 30 days of fuel and no supplies along the way. You're pretty unlikely to finish that journey. So that's the challenge. How do we, from an infrastructure industry perspective, start to address this? Okay, let me start here. This stuff is hard. And whether we're working on infrastructure systems with global impact, small-scale systems in rural areas, planning and executing these programs introduces a level of complexity and interconnectedness that can make even an accomplished engineer, one that really does this all the time, throw up her hands in frustration. I think for most people, and you know, if I'm wrong about this, ask questions about it, but this idea of a triple bottom line, here I've showed a quadruple bottom line, and I'll explain in a minute. It's kind of old hat, so I'm not going to be labored. Excuse me, but I want to highlight these aspects briefly to talk about some of the complexity we face in taking a systems approach to infrastructure. So working from the upper left, social. These are good issues of quality of life. When we build or we repair or we plan new infrastructure, how does that impact the social fabric of the communities in which we're working? How does it impact lower income, upper income, middle income, you know, across the spectrum of a community? Environmental aspects are, I think, the one in which, you know, with which maybe we're all most familiar, and in some ways are the most straightforward to address because we've been doing it for a while. Financial factors, these seem pretty straightforward as well. You know, we know how to do a balance sheet, we know how to cost out a project, until we start trying to monetize things like quality of life and the value of natural systems and the services nature provides. I'm going to touch on this a little bit later, so I won't stay there. Now, culture, this is kind of that fourth leg of what most people think of as the triple bottom line. It's not always explicitly considered in the U.S., but there's been some very fascinating writing about local culture as a framer of social needs and values. When we're planning and designing in our communities, more specifically, the infrastructure that makes our community work, does our work support that culture? So when you consider the interplay between all these and compare these to what I'll call our business as usual models, the way we've always delivered projects to date, and frankly, with pretty good financial success, it's pretty clear they don't make the grade going forward. So as global population grows from just north of 7 billion people now, toward a projected 9 billion around 2050, depending on what model you consult, and beyond, how do we evolve our existing models toward what I'll call the new business as usual? Okay, anybody discouraged yet? That was not my objective, but it does happen. It's a really complicated picture with no easy answers. I think Envision, on which I'm going to focus now, offers a piece of this solution on a couple of levels, and I'll sort of get into that as we go. Okay, a little bit of history. Two parallel efforts, each initially unaware of each other, led us to where we are today. Envision is a collaboration between, and this is a mouthful, so bear with me, the Zofnass Program of Sustainable Infrastructure at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, and the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure, which is a 501c3 based in Washington, D.C. A guy named Paul Zofnass and his sister Joan, who run a company that you heard of in the introduction because I work for them, a business consulting firm that deals solely with companies in the architect engineer industry, founded the Zofnass Program to address what they perceive, based on discussions with their clients. I mean, they've got a whole list of clients that do nothing but infrastructure, as a gap in infrastructure sustainability. Paul strongly believes in what many of us know, that you can only manage what you can measure. And he believed if we could measure the holistic sustainability of our infrastructure projects, we could improve how we do it. So he and Joan created this collaborative group of academics and industry experts. And as a side note, at one point we had 70% of the dollar value of the U.S. collaborating in that room, dollar value of engineering services in the U.S. And we started building what we then called the Zofnass rating system. Now, on a similar timeline, a little bit later, a couple years later, more alphabet soup. The American Public Works Association, the American Council of Engineering Companies, and the American Society of Civil Engineers, the group that grades infrastructure every year. You see that D+ report card come out. identified the same need, and they jointly founded the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure, which is a not-for-profit education and research institute. ISI began developing what would become Envision, but in 2011, we each found out about each other. A couple of quick conference calls and some meetings, and it was very clear that we were on the same path and needed to combine forces. We combined in 2011, and Envision was released shortly after that. Okay, so I've put up a timeline here to just kind of give you a more graphical view of this. And I want to cover a couple things about Envision. I think it's really important to recognize as we go through the rest of this webinar. The foundational purpose of ISI is to foster better practices in infrastructure design, building, and operating. So to that end, they offer things like credentialing. The ENVSP, you're going to see this term, ENVSP, Envision Sustainability Professional. These are the individuals who have been trained in the system, can help others understand how to apply it. Project verification. Let me see, I'm going to get my little pointer back. If you look here, they released it for public use, and then we started verifying and awarding. If you do a project by Envision, and it's important to you to be able to prove to your constituency that that project happened in the right way, you can do independent verification. And there are people that are trained to do such thing, and you can get an award. And similar to LEED, the awards are bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. Now, I haven't gone into the criteria for each one, but they're available on ISI's website, which is on my last slide, and I assume you'll be able to access it at a later date. It's also key that, and this is like probably one of the most important things, that except for credentialing, verification, and award, it's all available for free. Maybe a lousy business model, but it's part of the mission. If you go to sustainableinfrastructure.org and make an account, you can download everything to your heart's content. You can use it any way you want, and we don't track those downloads, so I encourage you to go check it out. Okay, whoop, backwards, that's bad. So that takes us to where we are today. There are 4,700. Think about this. We launched in 2012. There's 4,700, and by current projections, it'll be 5,000 ENVSPs by the end of the year. These are scattered across the United States, but also in some other geographies. There's 60+ trainers. These are the people that train the ENVSP. We've done some train-the-trainer work. 21 projects have gone through award, and these take a couple of years to go through. There's 15 currently being verified, about another 100 in the process. Clearly, we're getting a little bit of traction. Okay, so let's talk a little bit, I don't want to go into too much detail from the interest of time, what this system is. Envision evaluates projects against 60 credits in the 5 broad holistic categories you see here. So from the top over on the left, I want to cover these briefly. Quality of life. How do the projects impact the daily ebb and flow of life in the host community? As you'll see through an example that I've created, this one's pretty rich in opportunity. Leadership. This deals both with how the projects are led and managed, as well as with inclusive engagement out in the community. When you start to think about what solution you're going to implement, have you reached out to everybody that's got an opinion so that no one gets left out? It becomes an inclusive process. Resource allocation, working down toward the bottom, this is essentially the supply chain. When we build an infrastructure project, where do your pipes come from? Where does the fill come from? Where are all the materials? And what is the carbon content and other impacts from all these materials? This is a tough credit currently. I'll acknowledge that because a lot of this data is not readily available from suppliers. But if you're familiar with LEED, part of what the USGBC did with LEED is they drove that supply chain to provide that information, and we're hoping to have the same impact. The natural world, pretty self-explanatory. This is essentially environmental impacts. And then climate and risk, and this is an interesting credit category. This deals not only with how physical effects of climate change, like sea level rise and increased storm intensity, could impact your project, but also things like how future regulations that may come about, whether it's carbon pricing or wetland delineation, changes in construction codes, how that may impact the project in the future. So we need to be thinking about these things from day one so we design the right projects. And finally, on the right is the scale of achievement projects can earn. A couple things to note. The scale is nonlinear. So we try to drive people up the scale by giving them more points each time they move up. For each credit, these are the ratings that you can achieve. And then the other piece that I think is really interesting, if you look at this improved, enhanced, superior, conserving, in the beginning, the system ended at conserving. Conserving is essentially a net zero, no impact, no negative impact. And everybody thought, okay, if we get to no negative impact, that's a great thing. But then we had to acknowledge that some projects can actually be restorative. They can be net positive. So we added that as another credit of achievement. You won't see it in every credit. But we wanted to make sure that we knew, living on Earth and just doing no damage is bad. I mean, it's not bad, but it's not enough. So we wanted to put that extra win in. Okay, so I won't belabor that. So it's a pretty comprehensive rating system. I think even more powerful, and this is where I said it functions on a number of levels. Using these credit categories on the left as lenses at all project stages really take you to an interesting place. So when we plan infrastructure with a view to these lenses, we can minimize downsides, accentuate positive benefits, and a lot of times discover the co-benefits to which I referred earlier. Okay, big complicated slide, full listing of Envision's credits. We needed to put some structure to this, so we broke the 5 categories down into the 14 subcategories shown here. Tough to see, but if you visit the website at Sustainable Infrastructure, you can pull all this stuff down and you'll get it a little bit better. I'm not going to go in detail into those. Okay. There were several key questions we started when we developed Envision. One of the earliest was, and I got to tell you, this occupied a lot more time than maybe it should have, but it was very interesting. What's infrastructure? When we say we're going to make a rating system for sustainable infrastructure, what's included? Sure, it's things like roads, bridges, water systems, and the like, but what about things like IT networks, parks, other landscapes? What it really came down to is and this is a process of many hours, was we had to think about a city as a network. And that network, the buildings function as nodes, places where people congregate to work, live, and do a lot of other static activities. On the other hand, everything else becomes the connective tissue of that network, and that's what we decided was infrastructure. Then another big question, where in the project cycle should Envision apply? We very quickly realized that the beginning of design wasn't an option. By then, many decisions were already, if you decide what you're designing, you've already made a lot of decisions. So we agreed it had to start at project conception. Consider the need. What do we need to achieve with this project through these 5 lenses that make up Envision? And that helps us make the right decisions about which project will have the best set of impacts. For example, the question is not, how do I build the most sustainable stormwater treatment facility I can? But I have way too much stormwater. How can I best address that in a holistic way within the context and values of my local town? So that kind of took us to what we like to call our mantra. I don't think it's really official anything, but we say it a lot. First, build the right project, pick the right project, and then do it right. Make sense? I can hear you all nodding. Good. Okay, so I can hear it through the web already. This guy said he'd talk about how Envision can enable harmonious living. So I want to dig into 2 specific credits on a hypothetical example that essentially I created, so you have to live with it. Let's look at QL 2.4, which is a quality of life credit within the wellness category. So let's assume that City X, I don't care what you call it, is considering how to deal with an unacceptable level of traffic into a downtown. Pretty common problem in most major cities. The business as usual approach is to widen the main artery. Let's let more cars in. Let's get more throughput. This has been how we've been doing it for years. Tried and true solution. But suppose during planning, somebody backed up from that and suggested maybe a different approach would allow the resulting project to solve a couple of problems. Perhaps they consider adding a transit line in that same right-of-way instead of taking up the space with new lanes. So this would also reduce traffic, right? It might minimize air pollution at the same time. You're taking cars off the road, which in turn might reduce childhood asthma cases in the town and along the corridor. And they might consider, while they're doing it, tacking on a couple of biking and walking paths adjacent to the project. That's got a lot of potential benefits. Better recreation opportunities, perhaps reducing obesity and hence healthcare costs. Further, and I'm going to keep going here because I'm not done. Either of these would open up mobility opportunities for low-income residents who might not own cars to get to jobs along the route or close to the route. And it's certainly not a stretch to think about how these new paradigms could impact economic development. as employers start to see that multiple modes are available to bring customers to their door and get workers in the shop. So you begin to see a little bit about how a simple infrastructure planning decision can create these broad array of opportunities across the community. One investment, multiple co-benefits. That's the goal. Of course, I just made all this up, right? It's a hypothetical. But I think we can see it play out in communities that are actually implementing this, and there's a number of examples that I'm happy to address, at some later date if you guys reach out to me if it's of interest. Okay, let's talk about one more credit, and I want to continue with that previous example. So this is the Collaboration and Teamwork Credit LD 1.3, which lives in the collaboration subset, amazingly. As a community works to decide what solution offers the best path forward, it's really, and I can't say really enough here, critical to engage in a dialogue across the spectrum of folks that might be affected by the resulting project. From my perspective, there is no such thing as too much engagement. By beginning with a broad, inclusive set of participants, the community doesn't leave any ideas on the table. And maybe more importantly, it implicitly acknowledges that each community member brings value to the discussions. This can be absolutely key to progress once a project decision is made. How many times has a citizen heard about a project? I'm sure you've all had these experiences. When it's already at mid-design and the engineers come out at a public meeting and they say, here's what we're going to build. And how many times do those same citizens have the reaction, seriously? That's the dumbest thing I ever heard. I could do better than that. Or, geez, that's really going to impact my business or my family or the place where my kid plays baseball. If we exclude those individuals from initial discussions, we create the potential for this us versus them project that you see so often. And frankly, adversarial actions later down the road that can slow implementation, increase costs. You get people with picket signs, you get a lot of protests, people trying to change the game. So in the criteria for this credit, part of the higher achievement ratings includes systemic approaches to leading the entire stakeholder community through the process together. When I teach the ENBSP class, one of the things I tell the practitioners is probably the most important guy you got to have in the room is that super annoying guy that you really don't want to talk to, because eventually you're going to talk to them. So bring them in, make them part of the process, and show them that we value their opinion. When everybody's needs get heard, it can lead to opportunities to realize some of the co-benefits we discussed on the last slide. Well, if you fail to do so, it kind of leads to narrowly conceived business as usual. I keep saying that, business as usual solutions that really easily overlook a large portion of the community and may overlook the best solution. Okay, so we've walked through a lot of stuff so far. Now I'd like to show you an example, a project that worked through planning, design, and execution using Envision. The site's in Vancouver, Canada, where the Port of Metro Vancouver was experiencing an enormous amount of growth. If you've ever been to Vancouver, you'd understand why it's a really cool city. The site is a super strategic transportation link, but it's in a very constrained location. And as you'll see, the local transportation connections are really scary. Now, add to this mix a local community that's very concerned about impacts from the projected growth, and I'll take you through kind of a before and after slide, and then if I'm so fortunate as to work, I'll run through a short video to help you really appreciate what the project team accomplished. I should, as full disclosure, I want to tell you that the video was made by a company called Stantec, who was the lead engineer on this project. And they're also a member of the board at the Zoftness program and have been very instrumental in how Envision developed. So they're also an early adopter and doing some great work with it. Okay, this is Port of Metro Vancouver before. I want to point out a few things, so I got to go back to my little red laser pointer. You'll see a number of aspects here. So this is the community on a hill overlooking a port. Maybe not the best idea, probably a little bit disruptive to the quality of life up here. And then I want to work my way down the hill. So this is a very unstable slope, and you can see where it looks like it's slid from time to time, and that did happen. It would go down into the road. Now moving down to the transportation level, you have a highway corridor. You have a rail yard separated by nothing. Oh wait, they are separated by something, a bike lane. So between trains and cars are bicycles. I'm a bicyclist, and frankly, I don't think I'd want to ride here. So the community had a lot of concerns when the port started talking about expanding. Noise, light pollution, safety. There were just so many things. And when we talk about community engagement, I'll give the Stantec team and the port staff tremendous kudos. They went deep and they got to everybody. And it turned out there was an acoustical engineer that does noise analysis that lives up here in this community. And he ended up being a real key part of the stakeholder group and helped them develop the solutions. Okay, let's look at what they did. The after program, and you'll see more of this in the video. A couple things they did. The slope got stabilized by moving transportation to 3 levels. Up top, you have a local road and some bicycle and pedestrian connectors, and you'll see more of that in the video if it runs. Here's the highway, and then below, they took all the transportation modes and put them on different elevations. You can sort of see here that it's not a flat piece of concrete. They knew they had this monolithic concrete structure going in. So they brought in what they call First Nations in Canada. This is essentially the same kind of idea as our Native Americans, or people that lived in Canada before Europeans came in. And they put native art all along this. They're beautiful carvings, and they turned it into quite the amenity. The cycling and pedestrian amenity is incredible. So, you know, they created multiple benefits from a single project, and this is what they discovered. This is from Stantec's project team, and some of these guys had not been involved in Envision before. So let's see if we get lucky here. Go. Here. Okay, for the next 3.5 minutes, I'm going to be quiet.
Port Metro Vancouver's low-level road is the recipient of the Envision Partner Award for Sustainable Infrastructure.
Envision is a very, very powerful plan because it helps us think about not just what makes the project work, what makes it economical, what makes it function, but it helps us think about sustainability at every point of the project.
At Stantec, we always design with community in mind, and this project really demonstrates that in every aspect. We addressed several different disciplines of engineering challenges, as well as enhancing safety and increasing mobility. The existing low-level road alignment had vehicles, bicycles, and railway all within a few feet of each other. So we were able to tackle that challenge by separating the grades and having rail and vehicles and bicycles at different elevations with the community above that. The first challenge was really about trying to demonstrate to the community the technical justification from a safety standpoint, as well as the community benefits.
Without the support of the community, the allocation of the scarce resources necessary to make a project like this doesn't materialize. If they're not with you, there's no project. And that's why the Envision tool is such a helpmate to public officials and public administrators, because it helps them talk about complicated issues to voters, ratepayers, taxpayers, citizens, in terms that they can understand. And once they understand, it helps them to make better decisions.
Right now for Stantec, Envision is something we hope to do just as standard practice. Envision is just another tool in our pockets to help our design teams and our engineers to think about what they do that goes beyond just building a project for maximum operational benefit. There's all these other components about community, environment, long-term thinking that we have to start considering. A framework like Envision just becomes that go-to checklist that makes the job a little bit easier.
It took a lot of dedication and many hours of service from engineers, environmental scientists, landscape architects, essentially a very powerhouse dream team that came together to make this project a huge success.
It's wonderful to see that, you know, it's a project that doesn't do just in space engineering design, but it can have all these other layers of benefit.
And it's a wonderful project for just that reason.
So you start to see through that video how starting with Envision's concepts can really change the course of a project for the better, sometimes in startling ways. It requires vision, and no small amount of courage on the part of the infrastructure owner these days while such things are still pretty new. But as we see more and more communities recognizing the overall benefits, it becomes less necessary to have that level of courage. Okay, so we've learned that Envision works. Does that mean our work here is done? Far from it. We believe with the Zoffness program at ISI that we've only scratched the surface and have a long way to go. So I want to take a look at a couple of other things that are going on and are related. Okay, when Envision was approaching release to the public, there was a real split in the team. A number of people, look, we're engineers, right? And failure is not an option. So a lot of them wanted to wait and make sure everything was perfect. But as you hear in the marketplace, perfect is the enemy of the good. The market was ready for this tool. So the naysayers were overcome, and we released it and committed to continual improvement over time. So the version out now, it's V.2, covers mostly planning and design, with some aspects of construction and operations included. Currently, ISI's got a detailed effort ongoing to add the full-fledged construction components to the system, working with a major constructor in the country. And we expect that to come out for public comment late 2017-ish, and following comment-related revisions hit the market in 2018. Still to come, similar things for O&M, operations and maintenance components. There's also other tools that are included. So there's a one-page checklist you see down here on the lower left. And basically, this is if you're kind of just dipping your toe in the Envision water, you're not really sure. This has all the credits on it, and you can go through them and say, yeah, yes, that applies, it doesn't apply, maybe we should think about this. Very useful for beginning efforts. And then there's also some fledgling efforts to quantify the financial benefits of Envision, which I'm going to talk about over a couple of slides later. Okay, so Envision's successful in the US. As I mentioned, we're just getting started, right? Envision was launched for the North American market. But as more infrastructure practitioners and owners started to learn about it, ISI is fielding a lot of inquiries from across the globe asking to implement Envision in other geographies. So this is a work in progress. It can be really complicated to adjust this system for different cultures, different climates, different political landscapes. But I'm happy to say I just heard yesterday, I got an email yesterday afternoon that the first Spanish language training is going to happen in Spain next year, and so we are making progress. We're moving ahead. I'm going to address the next two bullets about scaling up and quantifying value in a couple slides here. Okay, one of our members at the Zoffness program, one of the advisory board members, is the Inter-American Development Bank. And they've been with us for a long time, and they're very interested in bringing Envision's concepts to their clients in Central and South America, which is their lending geography. So they teamed with the program team at Harvard and developed and sponsored the Infrastructure 360 Awards. You know, it's now in its third year. The first year they put it out, I was like, geez, will anybody really want this? You know, it's based on Envision concepts, and they just put an announcement out, hoping to get 10 entries. Well, that first year they got 60. There's a real hunger in the marketplace. Everybody knows that we need to, you know, sustainability is important, but it's this sort of amorphous, squishy concept. So Envision really gives it some structure. They took the submissions, winnowed them down to 12, did peer review, published case studies, a lot of things happened. There was a jury of practitioners and funders that decided on the award winners because they couldn't just happen in a business vacuum. There's this business focus that the bank brings to it. And the awards are presented at the bank's annual meeting by its president, Alberto Luis Moreno. There's always a keynote speaker, mostly by video, because they're very busy people. So they've had guys like Al Gore and Lord Norman Foster, who is the founder of Foster and Partners. You may remember them from London's Olympic venues. They were the lead designer. So still continuing. Again, we hope for more good things from that. Now, I said I would talk about scaling up from projects. When Envision hit the market and was turned over to ISI, the Zoffness program started working to scale up these concepts to apply on a systemic, full city scale. So infrastructure projects make up infrastructure systems, right? A water plant is part of a water distribution system, wastewater treatment, a road, part of a highway system. Cities are made up of multiple infrastructure systems. And these systems have to function together to support the city. So the program started looking at these and identifying the synergies and tensions between all these system components and put these together into a study. And as you can imagine, it was enough to give you a headache. It was extremely complex. But they worked through it. And the results were just published in the book you see here on the upper right called Planning Sustainable Cities. By the way, available in Kindle on Amazon.com if you're interested. Now let's talk a little bit about the valuing piece. Okay, so we know that sustainability has value. This is a biggie. And we know that it's pretty key to humanity's long-term survival. But the challenge is, how do you get that flywheel going? We know that many aspects addressed by Envision have economic value, but sometimes it's value that lives in another bucket, right? It's completely unrelated to your project. You have a project bucket, you know, the budget. For example, if the project we talked about before, you know, my hypothetical example, if it creates an opportunity for more exercise and recreation and citizens' overall health improves, that's a real fiscal benefit. Insurance rates are likely to go down, you know, less doctor visits, this kind of thing. But that doesn't live within a project budget. So it's very difficult to take credit for that. So by making these benefits explicitly available and visible with Envision, we can begin to recognize that connection. So the Zoffness program then created a tool. It's now in beta. We're still trying to continue to develop it, make it more user-friendly. It uses a whole range of peer-reviewed data that places economic value on the various components that Envision measures. Like so much of the work I've described, you know, it's still a work in progress. We did a beta test with New York City DEP, took one of their post-tropical storm Sandy projects through this cost analysis looking at whole costs. And the results were very promising and actually pointed the way that first light costs, you know, first light capital costs, were not the driver of project decision. You know, it's a 100-year piece of infrastructure. If you take it out 100 years, you look at whole cost over time, the decision would be different. So the results were really promising. New York City OMB loved them, and there's more to come, including how these efforts might help policymakers change the criteria by which they select infrastructure projects, you know, maybe considering a little bit of a different cost perspective. That is a topic we could have a whole other webinar on, so I'll leave that for now. Okay, you're almost done. Food for thought. This is my soapbox. I have 2 soapbox slides because there are things that I should warn you, I guess. When you take on the study of infrastructure and sustainability and that kind of thing, it's a little bit like a virus, and it's incurable. Once you get it, and once you see it, you can't get rid of it. So be careful about what you ask for. So we talked a little bit about the value and sustainability, and this is a little bit of a deeper dive. For as long as I can remember, we've lived in this take, make, waste business cycle. We account for hard money purchases, cost to produce and sell goods, but we ignore what we term externalities, the world's natural elements that really enable life and provide capacity for all its supporting infrastructure. So for the first time in human history, we've started to cut into that capacity in a way that evidence shows is potentially future limiting. So how do we fix that? I don't have a simple answer for you, but we've talked about some pretty promising tools and some beginnings. Bottom line is this challenge calls for everybody to be really creative and figure out how to account for our interactions with and incentivize preservation of our natural capital. Envision's a piece of the puzzle, but when I think about the people that are on this webinar and all the people that we talk with, whatever field you work in, you should be thinking about this. And you should be applying it to what you do and think about potential solutions. And when you think about them, by gosh, share them with the rest of the community. This is a really current and evolving space. Okay. I've put up 2 interesting and thought-provoking quotes from very different times. Now, I'm not an economist. I'm an engineer, which makes this a little dangerous, but if we ran businesses the way we measure our economy, we'd care only about sales, even to the detriment of profitability. GDP, our primary economic gauge, measures the stuff we make, and it largely omits the cost. So as a business person, I have to wonder, like, how sustainable this is. For how long can we measure the progress of our society solely on production? You know, what about costs? What about the things that don't live in the monetary world? How do we quantify them? There's alternatives out there. They range from this completely qualitative gross national happiness used in the Kingdom of Bhutan, to the social progress index, to the more quantitative genuine progress indicators, which actually 2 states in the US are beginning to make some policy around, Vermont and Maryland. Google them, they're real, they're out there, and they're very interesting. They start to add in some of the other things that make life worth living. So is this heretical? Maybe. Is it interesting? Absolutely, at least to me. I'd say it's directly applicable to the topics we've covered today. It goes to the very relevant issue of bringing our businesses, cities, and societies into a more sustainable balance, probably one of the defining issues of our time. Can changing can change what we value and how we account for it, help unlock new sources of capital to address our infrastructure deficits. Can address some of the growing social challenges we face, some of the social inequities. That remains to be seen, but I can tell you that increasingly infrastructure owners, their stakeholders, the firms that serve them are moving outside the box, sometimes throwing the box away altogether, trying new approaches, new partnerships to address the extreme funding deficits that we exist, along with the social problems. Infrastructure exchanges, impact investors, NGOs, and others are actively seeking ways to demonstrate real costs and benefits from acting systemically for the long term, and they're incentivizing new sources of capital into the market. So can you be part of this change? I think we all can, and I think we all have a role to play. So, okay, climbing down off my soapbox now. That's what I've got for today. I'm really thrilled to have had this opportunity to share Envision with you. As I think I mentioned, I usually talk to engineers, and I suspect we have a much broader cross-section of people on this webinar. If you're interested in knowing more, visit ISI at www.sustainableinfrastructure.org. Join our LinkedIn group, follow us on Twitter, the Zofness program, go to the Zofness program site, visit us there. Download the system, kick the tires, and tell us how you're using it. One of the cool things has been seeing the interesting ways Envision's being applied, many of which we don't even anticipate. If you need something you can't find, I've put my email there. By all means, contact me, and I'll be happy to try and connect you with it. So thanks again, and Sharon, I will take any questions that you have compiled, if any.
Okay, I actually do have a question here. I'm going to read it verbatim so you can answer it. U.S. infrastructure is key to economic growth. How do we create an infrastructure rating system that brings the needed transparency and catalyst for more investment in roads, bridges, airports, etc.?
How many hours do we have?
I know, that's why I was like, oh, this is going to take up the rest of the time.
So that's a big question. Let me try to break a couple things down.
Sure.
So, how do we develop a system? I think we have the basis of it here. And honestly, this is like kind of late breaking news sort of thing, but at the Zofness program, there's a Zofness program meeting today, which I will be heading out today and tomorrow, which I'll be heading off to tonight. We are about to try and kick off some new research really focused on that topic. We've been made up of planners, designers, engineers, architects, and there's been a big collaboration at the Zofness program with infrastructure owners. People, City Engineer of LA has been a big player. We've had a lot of people from New York come in. Kansas City, Missouri has been there. Seattle has been a lot of different people that have come in and collaborated with us. So what we hope to do now, and like I say, this is not even finished, it's happening today and tomorrow, is begin to reach out to infrastructure funders and to infrastructure policymakers. Because now that we can measure these things, and now that we can get our arms around, what does the bigger picture look like beyond the project boundary? How does it impact communities? I think it really changes the equations a lot of times in investment further. People in the insurance business, that underwrite these projects, people in the private capital business, the P3 market, commercial banks, regional development banks, all these guys are starting to look at things like climate risk, like the risk of social unrest, stranded assets, all these kinds of things. And I'm not sure, because I don't live in that world, but I'm not sure that there's a single system or a set of tools that helps them make decisions when they decide, can I lend into this market? Can I invest into this market? How will it impact my ROI? So these are things that we're going to try to start exploring. I don't know if that helps you, whoever asked that question, but I don't think there's an easy answer to that one. I think it is absolutely critical that we begin to bring some private capital into this. We are not going to succeed with our traditional model. And further, if we can bring the private capital, I think part of what helps the private capital come in, we have to acknowledge that when you bring private capital for ROI into public infrastructure, citizens are suspicious. Right? We're bringing the big corporate evil people in, and they're going to take all our money and take our water and charge us a lot for it, right? But if we can quantify what the benefits are to the community in very real terms, and start to put, some money, some of the stuff doesn't have hard monetary value, but we know it's valuable. People like Kaiser Permanente are very involved in that kind of thing, trying to figure out how it impacts health of their communities and their insurance. If we can start to get all this into one bucket, and make it a little bit more visible and a little more easy to understand, I think the communities would be more amenable to having private capital invested. So I guess I'll leave it there unless somebody wants to follow up.
There's another thing with the difference between private capital and government. Like, what would be the difference with that? That's kind of the question.
Well,
I don't know what that means.
yeah, I mean, look, today, if you want to fund an infrastructure project, the community either pays for it in their current budget or they bond it, right? They go out to the market and they get funding for it. So that's a very traditional model. There's two other sources of capital that I know of. You know, one is the pure commercial capital. That's private capital that wants to be invested. I mean, there are groups out there like CalPERS. It's a California Employees Pension Fund. And they have billions of dollars invested. They would like to invest it in something that's safe, that has a moderate rate of return over the long haul, and does some social good. You know, because that's what their members want them to do. So, you know, that's almost an impact kind of capital. There is a whole series of people in the country, mainly, actually, this is interesting, I met with an investment group that showed me a profile of investors that had a 30 under 30 list. So these are 30 kids that are 30 years and under that are each going to inherit in excess of $1 billion. Now, we could weigh in on that whole deal, but they learned that they need to get ROI from their investments. But they also learned, or, you know, through their, maybe it's their optimism of youth, or maybe it's the generation of millennials, they want to do something good with that money. So they're willing to accept a slightly lower rate of return than perhaps just a pure arbitrage, but they want to do some good. So there's a whole lot of capital sitting on the sidelines because nobody really knows what's going to happen with infrastructure. I mean, okay, we could get political with it. We need an infrastructure plan. We need an infrastructure bank. There's a lot of pieces in this, and I doubt very much if I will address them adequately, even if I had all day.
Thank you. I hope that answered the questions. If there is any more questions, type them in fast. Otherwise, we'll hang out for like a half a minute or so. But I wanted to thank Bob for doing this. It was really interesting, and I can see how hard it is to put all of this into 45 minutes because there's a lot of information. But I hope you enjoyed it. I'm just going to see, Bob, you want to hold on and see if there's another question that will come in? Otherwise, if there are no further questions, but you think of one afterwards and you want to ask him, his information is right here on the slide. I will also send you his email along with some information from the presentation today. So if you think of anything else that you'd like to ask of Bob, you can do that one-on-one, if that's okay with you, Bob, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So I don't see any other questions coming in. And we're heading into the hour, so I guess we're going to end it. And Bob, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate you all coming. And we will be in touch with you regarding where you can view this if you want to see it again or anything. We have recorded it. So again, thank you, Bob. Anything else you want to say? Otherwise, we will say goodbye.
No, I'm good. I said what I had to say.
And it was great. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
See you again.